Why did America's air defenses suddenly and remarkably fail on 9/11? The official account of what happened that day has changed multiple times and in multiple ways. The final account appears in the 9/11 Commission report, and it's based on this idea that everyone in the United States military and everyone at the FAA were lying, basically calling them liars in the official 9/11 Commission report. So what really happened that day with the United States air defenses? Let's ask Kevin Ryan. He's been investigating this for years. He's the co-editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies, and he joins us now. Kevin, great to see you. This is a piece of the story that has been I'll admit, it's been a blind spot for me, right? We focus on a lot on the hijackers, the buildings, the demolition, etc. But the air defenses, the air defense systems, this has been a really sort of a blind spot for me, and I'm really curious what caught your attention about it for you that you wanted to really start diving into this piece of the story?
Well, I've been investigating 9/11 for 21 years, and I began looking into the World Trade Center destruction, but as co-editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies now for 18 years, I've also been involved in researching the air defense failures. As you said, there were multiple changing stories, and that's what catches a lot of people's attention when they change the story and backtrack in a number of ways that make, for example, the military or NORAD look better. That's suspicious, and that's when people start looking a little bit closer. And I'd be happy to go through those stories with you to talk about exactly why they might have done that and what the final story looks like.
Yeah, let's do that. So let's paint a picture first for our audience here. What is the official story that we've all been told? And maybe it's safe for me to call it the fake story, the cover-up story, the 9/11 Commission report story. So what is the fake story that we've all been forced to swallow since 9/11?
Well, the final story from the 9/11 Commission had to do with failures of communication, and critically, failures of communication between the FAA and what's called NORAD. And the NORAD is basically the military air defenses. And so the 9/11 Commission said that really the problem came down to just incredible communication failures between these two agencies. And there's remarkable facts about that as well that we should discuss. But basically, they told us in the end that the military was not notified about the planes until after they had crashed. They got 8 minutes notification on the first hijacking, but for the second, third, and fourth hijackings, we're told by the 9/11 Commission that the military was just never notified until after the planes had crashed. And of course, why that's remarkable, as you mentioned earlier, is that we were told by the military and the FAA previous to that, for a period of 3 years, that the military had been notified about all these planes, that they had actually gotten notification on Flight 175, the second plane, 20 minutes before it crashed. They had gotten notification about Flight 77, the third plane that crashed into the Pentagon, 14 minutes before it crashed. And they had gotten notification of Flight 93 that crashed in Pennsylvania 47 minutes before it crashed. And so, just thinking about this, if we know the 9/11 Commission did admit finally that there were interceptor jets scrambled from 2 Air Force bases, and these are F-15 jets that fly at 1,900 miles per hour, so they could have reached New York City in 8 minutes, just immediately. And the others for the Pentagon and the United 93, those interceptor jets were F-16s, which flew also at 1,500 miles per hour. So they could have easily caught up with these hijacked aircraft. And so for 3 years, people were wondering, they were amazed why the military jets never caught up. And just to put it in perspective, in the year 2000, the military had scrambled aircraft to intercept errant aircraft 129 times in the year 2000. And they had scrambled jets 67 times in the first half of 2001, successfully, no problems. So the problem was for almost 2 hours on 9/11, the nation was left undefended in over the skies. I mean, the military didn't intercept any of these four aircraft, despite all of this notification and plenty of time for the jets to catch up. So it was amazing when we finally heard in the final report that, and this came from Philip Zelikow, who was the executive director of 9/11 Commission. If people don't know him, he's a professional myth maker, and
Right.
he wrote the outline for the 9/11 Commission report before the investigation began. But it was his idea to come up with a memorandum that basically said, well, we can't explain, in so many words, we can't explain this because they were never notified. So the military was never notified, so therefore they were off the hook. And, as you said, the FAA had already testified to the 9/11 Commission in contradiction to that, saying that the NORAD folks had been involved the entire time, had been in with phone bridges and communication bridges, had been in contact with FAA, knew everything FAA knew. And basically, as soon as a plane like those hijacked on 9/11 deviated from its course or failed to communicate or turned off its transponder, it was an automatic, no procedures really necessary, an automatic response between FAA and NORAD that interceptor jets would be scrambled. And that just didn't happen on 9/11. And that's one of the main reasons that people can see. There are a number of other reasons, but that the official account for 9/11 is just a giant lie.
It's unbelievable to me. What would be the purpose then of trying to hide that the military said, no, we knew about this. We could have been scrambled in minutes. I guess if you're sitting at home wondering, well, what's the purpose then of trying to hide that piece of the story? What's the purpose of that?
Well, one purpose is that if they did get the notification of 20 minutes on Flight 175, 14 minutes on Flight 77, and 47 minutes on Flight 93, they should have been able to catch up and intercept the jets. So if they had done that, if they had caught up and intercepted the jets, or I'm sorry, the hijacked aircraft, the airliners, they would have been able to, as they had before, look into the cockpit and see who was flying the planes. This is an important point
Right.
in 9/11 research right now, because a lot of people believe, and including myself, that the planes were actually remotely hijacked using technology that existed at the time and had been practiced that year leading up in the months leading up to 9/11. So if the interceptor jets had actually done this, they would have seen who was flying the planes. Now, there are a number of reasons why they didn't. One reason was that the aircraft flying to New York City were actually, the interceptor jets were told to form a holding pattern out in a practice area over the Atlantic. So instead of flying directly to New York City, they flew in a holding pattern over the Atlantic. And
Do we know who do we know who would have given that order? No, don't go and intercept. So we now know that there were interceptor jets out there. They were scrambled, but told not to intercept those hijacked plane, but instead to go out in a holding pattern. Do we know who gave that order to stay in a holding pattern and not intercept them?
Yes, we do. We do know that those orders came from the Air Force headquarters and needs in the northeast sector of NORAD. And so it hasn't really been explained exactly why that happened, but we do know that happened, and we do know who gave the orders. The other inexplicable order that was given, particularly for the jets that were launched for Flight 77 and United 93, they were also sent out over the Atlantic in the wrong direction. Those orders were actually changed after launch, so they were scrambled on a heading to Washington, and then the orders were changed to head out over the Atlantic. And moreover, they were asked to fly at a small fraction of their speed, so subsonic speeds, right? These are jets that flew at multiple times the speed of sound, but yet they were asked to fly at subsonic speeds. So they were flying the wrong direction at a fraction of their maximum speed, and they weren't going to catch up. They weren't going to get to the area that they needed to be in because of these orders. But, all of that went away really when the 9/11 Commission came up with a story that NORAD just wasn't notified until after they crashed anyway. But it's not really a believable overall story. But what's most unbelievable is that the military might have been all these military officers might have been lying for years. Right? Nobody's going to really believe that. It's just that people don't understand the official account, which is that exactly. And moreover, there was a book published in January 2003 called Air War Over America. It was published by the Air Force itself, by the Air Force Public Relations Office, in which they interviewed hundreds of military people. And this book was reviewed by all of the top military brass. And it talked about how the military was tracking these planes and how it was intending to shoot down some of them. But all of that testimony was thrown out the window, right? All of that entire book was thrown out the window because the official account ultimately said they never got notification. They were never tracking the planes.
So they're all lying. All these members of the United States military, they're all lying. Have any whistleblowers come forward to put their face to these messages and say, look, I am not lying. I was scrambled that day. We knew about this ahead of time. We had these different minutes, 17 minutes, 47 minutes. We knew about this. Why are they ignoring this?
Well, all of their testimony previously is on the record, and in some cases on the congressional record. So the general who's in charge of NORAD was General Ralph Eberhart. He was the commander of NORAD. He was the commander of U.S. Space Command. And he gave testimony in the U.S. Congress in 2001 saying they had documented evidence, documented notification of Flight 175 and documented notification of the hijacking of Flight 77. This is on the record, congressional record. And as you probably know, lying to Congress is a felony. It's a major crime. Right? But he never was called out for that because he went along with the official 9/11 Commission account. So basically, the 9/11 Commission, after stating this concept that everybody had been lying or were just terribly mistaken in their memories for a period of 3 years, they did a little negotiation with the NORAD personnel and got them to agree to the idea that they were just so terribly mistaken and they weren't tracking any planes, but. It's not going to be one of them, in my opinion, who's going to be a whistleblower, although in some cases, maybe a lower level person. There were exercise intelligence agents who were saying they've tracked the planes. This is all in the documentation from the 9/11 Commission. But if one of them wants to come out today and state that, yes, we were definitely tracking the planes, that would be great. But at this point, I'm not aware of any who have actually done that.
Well, I think on the record testimony in front of Congress is powerful enough. To me, that's powerful enough. You also talk about that there are a bunch of questionable characters that were brought in at the FAA who obstructed the response. So there was not only sort of the whitewashing of this testimony, but there was a cover-up of the response and not only that, an impediment, like putting up roadblocks. Can you talk about some of the roadblocks that were thrown out there in this investigation?
Yeah, absolutely. There were two really questionable characters brought into FAA before 9/11. The first one was Benedict Sliney, who was the National Operations Manager for FAA at FAA headquarters. So this guy was on his first day at the job, if you can believe this. This is his first day on the job. He had previously been a lawyer on Wall Street. So he trained a little bit for a couple of months, and then they put him in this job. First day on the job is 9/11. He's the National Operations Manager for FAA, right? And there are a lot of people.
You can't make this up.
No, you can't make this up. So here he is. There are all these people in FAA who have decades of more experience. They're in the same office, but they let him take over and call the shots. And so at 8:15, he was told about the hijacking of American Flight 11. And for some reason, It was 30 minutes later before he notified NORAD, right? They know allegedly. Although the FAA had already communicated via memo to the 9/11 Commission that they had communication bridges with NORAD all along. But this guy, he's stalling, right? He's stalling. And he ultimately used the excuse that he never got a request to authorize a request for military assistance. It's just absurd, right? Because it's an automatic process. It was automatic 129 times in the year 2000, 67 times in the first half of 2001. And suddenly there's all this hesitation about whether we should notify, whether we should request or authorize a request to request. It's just crazy. But this second guy at the FIA who was brought in 9 months before 9/11 came from being the commander of the Joint Special Operations Command. If you're not aware of what that is, that's the military's covert operation command. So, special operations, covert operations, he was running those, and he decided to become the FAA's hijack coordinator, which again is an unusual change of job. But right. when he came, he began running, according to an FAA intelligence employee, whose remarks are on the record for at the 9/11 Commission. General Canavan was his name. General Canavan began conducting tabletop exercises that were, quote, pretty damn close to the 9/11 plot. Right? For the months before 9/11, he was running exercises that were basically mimicking what would happen. But more importantly, on the day of 9/11, General Canavan was missing. This is the role that the 9/11 Commission said was critical in the communication failures between FAA and NORAD. This hijack coordinator at FAA would contact somebody at the military. It was actually the deputy director of operations at the National Military Command Center. And that guy was missing too. Right, so General Canavan's missing for just the morning. They never even asked him about it at the 9/11 Commission. This is what we're going to say. Right, where were you? This is the most critical role in communication between FAA and NORAD. And he just went. I guess he said later that he went to Puerto Rico and he just wasn't available, and nobody was identified as his backup. So the most critical role was not that critical on the day of 9/11, apparently. But this FAA, this communications to NORAD went to Winfield. Montague Winfield was a general at the National Military Command Center. He was also missing. And when
they're
you
all
look
missing
into it,
on this day.
Well, you look. No kidding. You find out when you look into it, the entire military chain of command was missing. So President Bush, if you're not aware, was at a
kindergarten
visit to an elementary school, right? Reading with kids in an elementary school. The Secret Service was not protecting him. He was there for 35 minutes after the attacks began. It was a highly publicized event. So he was taken out of the picture by just sitting there reading My Pet Goat to the children. The Secretary of Defense was the next line in the military chain of command, and he went missing as well. He didn't know anything about what was going on, he said, until the Pentagon was attacked, at which point he went out into the parking lot and tried to help people with stretchers for more than 30 minutes and couldn't be contacted. It's incredible. These are incredible stories, but they're true. And the next person in the chain of command was Hugh Shelton, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he was out of the country. He was gone to Europe, just mysteriously. And then, Winfield Montague, he was also out of, and Canavan was out. Everybody was out just for that morning, just for those hours. So that's another big reason why things didn't go very well. But one of the more important reasons was that there were military exercises going on 9/11, and they actually not only mimicked the events, but they obstructed the response. So you may be aware that before 9/11, and a couple of years before 9/11, there were 28 hijack exercise scenarios that the military practiced. And about a quarter of those were suicide missions into high-value targets, right? So people don't hear about this very often, but if you research, you'll find out that the information is there that the military practiced this. And they practiced this on 9/11. There was an exercise called Vigilant Guardian in 2001 that was practiced on 9/11. And it had been going on for a couple of days, but on September 9th, they had practiced the hijacking for a suicide attack against the United Nations building in New York City, just a few blocks from the World Trade Center. That's 2 days before 9/11. On September 11th, they were conducting similar hijack events in which they were inserting simulated hijackings into the live air surveillance system. So they call it sim over live. These simulated injections were confusing the people who were supposedly responding. They all thought it was an exercise. And they, in their testimonies to the 9/11 Commission, they say, we thought the exercise had started early. And the evidence shows that the simulated injections continued until after the attacks and definitely disrupted the response.
So you have all of these high-ranking members of the military, the chain of command gone, missing, all of these folks at the FAA missing, gone. You have these simulated attacks being injected in and being run on that particular day. Seems like the perfect, and then you have what many believe, we on this show as well, with the experts we've had here on the show, that these aircraft were remote controlled. They were not piloted by these morons who couldn't pilot a Cessna. They didn't know what they were doing. With precision, absolutely not. So these were remote controlled aircraft being manipulated on that particular day, and that's why we don't have jets scrambling to get close to the cockpit to confirm that these pilots are not actually piloting the plane. It all seems, I mean, you look at Occam's razor, right? All of these things point to a massive, massive cover-up, no?
It definitely does. And, you can see the different ways that the 9/11 official account is false. And they all look very much as if it was a cover-up. And, you may know that in the 9/11 Commission report, they didn't even mention some of the major events that happened that day, like the destruction of World Trade Center Building 7 didn't even show up in the report. Right. Or the testimony of the 9/11 hero William Rodriguez or the FBI whistleblower Sibel Edmonds. These are critical testimonies that never showed up in the report. And this cover-up of the air defenses was really had to come down to, well, everybody was just lying. They weren't tracking the planes. And I can say that 2 years after the 9/11 Commission report came out, they justified this new account. They tried to justify this new account through an article in a magazine called Vanity Fair. And you may remember something that they called the NORAD tapes. So that they suddenly found some tapes, right? Some tapes of that somehow explained away how they didn't really know about it, and the communications failures were the big problem. Well, this reporter, he had gotten privileged access to these NORAD tapes that apparently NORAD didn't even know about, right? So that's amazing in itself. But they tried years later to justify it, but really they never came down to the explanation of why would all these people be lying in order to make themselves look bad. So if you think about this, that's exactly what it is. If they were never notified, they would just have said, we were never notified. How could we possibly have intercepted the jets? But that's not what they said. They said, yes, we were notified with 20 minutes notice on Flight 175, 14 on Flight 170 or 77, and 47 minutes on Flight 93. And we were tracking these planes. It's in detail. They give detailed testimony to this. Generals and colonels and people who, we just wouldn't expect to be lying for any reason, particularly for a reason that makes them look bad ultimately.
And also, I remember, on that day, news stations were reporting about the flight over Pennsylvania. And tracking it in real time, right? It had gone missing. Where was it over Pennsylvania? So even news reports, even if you want to discount NORAD or being notified, right? Even like NBC News, the Today Show, and others were reporting about this flight. So they would have been fully aware of this.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And not only that, but air traffic controllers were taking notes. So FOIA released documents show that air traffic controllers were writing notes about having been flight 93 having been hijacked and where it was going on the Ohio and Pennsylvania border long before it crashed. So why would they all just create these fictional accounts that
Right.
it makes no sense whatsoever unless psychologically you really need to believe the official account, which is the case for a lot of people. They just psychologically, I think they really need to believe the official account. So um, you know, whatever way they can do that, they're willing to accept.
I think there's a cognitive dissonance out there, whether it's on the assassination of JFK. They want the official story to be one particular way, one shooter. They don't want the discussions about a conspiracy, which we now know verifiably is the case, whether it's the assassination attempt on President Trump or the 9/11 attacks. And so it's unbelievable to me that the American populace would sit back and say, that's okay. So this 9/11 Commission report, you've left out critical testimony on purpose. FBI whistleblowers, others about these pilots, and there's all sorts of critical information you've purposefully left out of the 9/11 Commission report, or you purposefully didn't interview individuals or ask them critical questions. That's all missing from the official 9/11 report. And I remember at the time when the 9/11 report came out, it was a bestseller. Remember the 9/11 Commission report hit bookstores? Yep. I mean, it was billed by the media as a page turner, a thriller. And you could read it, and it was a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. So it was a lot of media hype and a lot of media pushing of this official fake narrative of what happened that day.
Yeah, and they even came up with if you remember, a comic book version of the 9/11 Commission report. So they thought they could sell it a little bit. Yeah, if you don't remember that, they tried to make it as simple as possible and push it as hard as possible. But the bottom line is that most people, the average citizen, they don't have time to dig into the research, into looking into things and looking at the ever-changing accounts. They just see the 9/11 Commission report and they either support it or they don't. But they don't need a comic book. They need facts. And really, given the impact of 9/11, if people aren't aware, nearly 5 million people were killed in the wars, indirectly and directly. As per Brown University's Cost of War project, nearly 5 million people died in the wars that were justified from 9/11. And additionally, there was an authorization for the use of military force, which is basically the authorization for the president to start preemptive wars whenever he wants to. Presidents have used this since then. Joe Biden used it this year in January of 24 when he drone bombed Iraq. He cited this authorization of use of military force from 2001. So these things, the mass surveillance, the torture, all of this goes back to 9/11. It changed the world in really negative ways and changed our lives and our ability to remain a free democracy in many ways. And people really need to start thinking about looking at 9/11 closely again and seeing where we've been and what we likely will see going forward if we accept these kinds of lies.
And if people are wondering why would they do that? Well, you just answered it, right? It's the rise of the massive military-industrial complex. It's the Patriot Act. It's total control of our lives. It's surveillance, of course. We know Edward Snowden, and his breakthrough reports on what the NSA was doing after 9/11. So all of this combined shows total control. It shows a manipulation of our government. It shows a manipulation of the U.S. dollar. And we are now $35 trillion in debt and over 5 million people killed in these forever wars that we can just perpetuate. Everyone wants to praise Donald Trump. Yeah, he didn't start any new wars, but he extended the drone programs in these regions throughout Syria and these other regions. So yes, you didn't start any new wars, but it's an expansion of what was started after 9/11. It all comes back to that morning. So if anyone out there is wondering why this was all put in place, I think you just answered it. That total control. What are you hoping? What are you hoping we'll see from this, Kevin? This awareness about this. Are you hoping that we'll maybe get a new 9/11 commission, one with fresh eyes? What are you hoping for the families and for America?
That's a good question. I don't believe a new 9/11 commission. I don't believe another government commission will get to the bottom of 9/11 unless it's a foreign government. And there's a possibility because citizens of many countries died on 9/11. But what we're trying to do at the International Center for 9/11 Justice is raise awareness and establish an accurate account of what happened for a number of reasons. One reason I believe is important is that we will see these kinds of things happen again if we haven't already. And we need to be able to recognize them as they're happening as quickly as possible so that we don't allow the government to incorporate all sorts of oppressive measures that will be with us for decades if we don't recognize them and cut them off quickly. So awareness is important so that we can recognize the next event and events that happen in the future.
Hallelujah. Well, Kevin Ryan has been my guest. He's been investigating this for years. He's the co-editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies, and we thank you so much for all of your research in this and educating all of us about what really happened on that day. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.